Colin Harker slid the ring from Verity's finger, while she was still standing in their own kitchen. He didn't ask, he didn't explain. He simply reached across the marble counter, took her left hand, with the easy confidence of a man who has already made every decision that matters, and worked the ring loose like it was an item he was repossessing. Then he turned and placed it in Ainsley Pryce's open palm, and he smiled. The slow, deliberate smile of a man who believes he has finally arrived somewhere worthy of him. 14 years of marriage, 14 years of the kind of love that doesn't perform itself, that shows up in the unglamorous necessary ways that hold a life together. In late evenings over project drawings, in the steady presence of someone sitting beside you through every failure, believing in a version of you that doesn't exist yet. All of it, gone in the space of a breath. He looked at Verity. His expression was almost gentle, which was worse than contempt. "You've always been exactly who you are," he said. "I need someone who's still becoming." Ainsley said nothing. She closed her fingers around the ring. Verity looked at her husband, then at the woman beside him, composed, deliberate, watching, with the careful attention of someone who came to this room specifically to witness this moment. Verity didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at them both with the particular stillness that comes not from numbness, but from depth. From knowing, somewhere very certain and very quiet, that she was already further ahead than either of them understood. If you're new to Ivory Secrets, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. I don't want you to miss a single moment of what happens next, and drop a comment right now. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Because this is the story of Verity Nash, and of the man who thought he understood exactly what he was walking away from. The night Colin Harker decided to end his marriage, he did not choose a private moment. He did not sit his wife down in a quiet room with honesty in his voice. He arrived home at 7:30 with Ainsley Pryce on his arm and a rehearsed kind of certainty in his posture. The posture of a man who has spent weeks constructing a version of events in which he is the protagonist of a necessary reinvention, not the architect of a betrayal. Verity had been in the kitchen when she heard the elevator open. She had been washing the last of the dinner dishes. She always cooked on Thursdays. Always the same lamb stew her grandmother had taught her in the farmhouse kitchen outside Perth, Ontario, when Verity was 9 years old. And grief had just arrived in her life for the first time. Cooking on Thursdays was one of those anchors, the kind that holds you to who you are when everything else is moving. She heard 2 sets of footsteps on the hardwood. She heard Colin's voice, lower than usual, the particular register men use when they are performing for someone new. She heard a woman's laugh, light and practiced, the kind that knows it's being listened to. Verity set down the dish towel. She stood still for a moment, hands at her sides, and she listened. When she walked into the living room, Ainsley Pryce was already appraising it. A subtle sweep of someone calculating what she would change. She was polished, in the precise way that costs real money, the kind of beauty that announces its own curating. She stood beside Colin like a statement. "Verity," Colin said, not a greeting, a label. "Who is this?" Verity asked. Her voice was even. "This is Ainsley. We've been seeing each other." He said it the way one announces a corporate restructuring. Factual. Concluded. Verity looked at Ainsley, who extended her hand with a smile that didn't commit to warmth. "I've heard a great deal about you." Verity didn't take the hand. "Colin," she said, "why is she in our home?" "That's what I need to talk to you about." He shifted his weight slightly. The first crack in the performance, quickly papered over. "I think we both know this marriage hasn't been what either of us needed for a long time." "Do we?" she said. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm asking a question," Verity said. "Do we both know that? Because I didn't. I thought we were building something." "We were," he said, "and I've built it. I'm somewhere different now. I need someone who matches where I am." 14 years pressed against the back of her throat. 14 years of scraping through the early years of his architecture firm on her salary, on connections she had carefully never explained, on the belief she had carried for both of them that what he was trying to build was worth the difficulty. 14 years of choosing him, quietly and completely. "You think I don't match where you are," she said. "Verity," his voice was gentle in the way of someone who has rehearsed being reasonable. "You've never wanted what I want, the recognition, the rooms. You've always been happy in the background." She looked at him for a long, level moment. "I was happy with you," she said simply. "That's different." Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly, but its cousin. A flicker that closed almost before it opened when Ainsley shifted slightly beside him. Colin reached into his jacket pocket. He had already taken the ring. She noticed that only now, her left hand suddenly lighter than it should have been, the absence of it, a cold, small shock. He held it toward Ainsley. "This belonged to my family," he said. "It should be with someone who fits the life I'm building." Ainsley accepted it without hesitation. Verity looked at the ring in his outstretched hand. She looked at it for exactly the time it took to understand what it meant. Then she said, "I'll be out by the weekend," and she turned and walked down the hallway. She heard Ainsley say behind her, in a voice calibrated for carrying, "She took that very well." She heard Colin say, "She always does." She heard him laughing softly. Verity pressed her back against the hallway wall, alone in the dark, and she let the tears come. Not because she was weak, because 14 years is a long time, and real love, even the love that turns out to have been less than what you gave, leaves a wound that takes longer to understand than a single evening. She allowed herself 3 minutes. She stood in the dark and breathed through it. Then she pushed off the wall, walked to the bedroom, and pulled her grandmother's old canvas bag from the top shelf of the wardrobe. She packed methodically. Clothes. Her grandmother's copy of The Bush Garden, pages soft from years of handling. The photograph taken at the farmhouse when Verity was 12. Both of them standing in the October garden, faces turned toward the same light. She left Colin's favorite mug on the counter. She left a note on the kitchen island. "Lock the door. Behind you. It's still my name on the lease." She meant it, practically. But standing in the elevator as the doors closed, she thought, "I mean all of it. Lock the door. Don't let anything decay in the open." She stepped out onto Bay Street. It was November, and Toronto was cold, with the particular honest cold of a city that doesn't apologize for its winters. She stood on the pavement for a moment, suitcase beside her, looking up at the building she had shared with Colin for 9 years. She looked for 10 seconds, then she picked up her bag and walked. She took a cab to a hotel on Wellington and checked in with a card she hadn't used in years. One connected to an account Colin had never known about because it had never been relevant to mention. She sat on the edge of the bed in her coat. Her phone showed 11 messages from Cora Finlayson, her closest friend, who had apparently heard something, through someone who had seen Colin and Ainsley at a gallery opening 3 weeks earlier and had been trying, in the urgent, careful way of a good friend, to figure out how to say it. Verity set the phone face down. She sat still for a long time, and in that stillness, something that had been waiting patiently at the back of her life, not sleeping exactly, more like standing in the hallway with its coat on, finally moved forward. Here is what Colin Harker had never known about the woman he had just walked away from. He hadn't known because Verity had spent 14 years making absolutely certain no one would know. Because that had been the promise. The same promise made in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender, 15 years earlier, when Verity was 26 and sitting across the table from her grandmother in the farmhouse outside Perth. Verity Nash was 81 that autumn, and her hands shook when she poured the tea, but her eyes were entirely clear. She had built over 60 years one of the largest private land and conservation portfolios in the province of Ontario, assembled with the same quiet, methodical patience with which she had raised her granddaughter after Verity's parents died in a highway accident outside Kingston when Verity was 8. 2 years of ice storms and bad luck and clear road and a truck that came from nowhere. Adora had never appeared on any list, any society page, any board with a public profile. She was, to most of the world, a retired school teacher from Perth County who grew her own tomatoes and knew the name of every bird on her property. She had built her fortune through decades of rural land acquisition, conservation, easements, and an investment discipline so rigorous and so quiet that even her own solicitor sometimes forgot the full scope of what he was managing. She had one grandchild. "I want to ask something of you," Adora said that autumn afternoon. "Anything," Verity said. "Go live your real life without the weight of this, without telling anyone what you carry, not until you are completely certain." She paused, her tea cooling between her hands. "Money changes how people see you, Verity. I've watched it change everyone who found out about mine. I want you to find people who love the version of you that needs nothing from them. Only then will you know it's real." Verity had promised. She had kept that promise through graduate school, through 12 years of landscape architecture work in Toronto, through 14 years of marriage, to a man who believed, sincerely and completely, that he was the more successful partner in the relationship. She had watched Colin grow. She had watched success teach him things about himself, not all of them good. The ambition had always been there. The money had simply given it permission to expand, at the expense of everything quieter. Now, sitting in a hotel room on Wellington Street, with her coat still on, Verity felt the promise release her. She had her answer. Colin had loved the idea of her once. But what he had been unable to do was grow in the ways that mattered. In patience, in the willingness to see what was quietly beside him every day. She took out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't dialed in 8 months. Jeffrey Marr had been Adora Nash's solicitor for 27 years and Verity's for the past decade. He was 63, measured and precise, and the single most informed person alive about the full scope of what Adora had built. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Nash," he said in that unhurried voice, "I've been wondering when I might hear from you." "Jeffrey," she said, "it's time." A pause. He knew precisely what she meant. "Are you all right?" "No," she said honestly, "but I will be. Can we meet you tomorrow?" 9 o'clock, he said. "I'll have everything ready." She arrived at his office on King Street at 8:58. The receptionist, a young man who had clearly been briefed, adjusted his posture almost imperceptibly when she gave her name. He offered coffee before she could ask. Jeffrey came out personally to bring her in. He shook her hand with both of his, the way he had since the day Adora died and Verity had sat in this same office and heard the will read in full. Not the summary her grandmother had given her years earlier, but the complete architecture of what had actually been built. He opened the first of 3 folders. The Nash Land Trust, as it currently stood across all conservation easements, rural land holdings, and subsidiary entities, had a total value that Jeffrey named steadily, without drama, watching her face. Verity set down her coffee cup. "That's considerably more than I understood," she said. "Your grandmother was exceptionally patient," Jeffrey said. "Compound growth over 6 decades in the hands of someone who never chased trends and never panicked. She used to say the secret to building anything that lasts is the same as the secret to integrity. Do the right thing, consistently, when no one is watching." Verity felt the familiar ache of missing her. That sounds exactly like her. Jeffrey turned to the second folder. "There are aspects of this I need to walk you through carefully, because they concern your current situation directly." Colin Harker's first major project, the Corktown waterfront development that had launched his career 11 years ago, had struggled badly in its early stage for capital. 2 of its 3 critical funding rounds had been secured through a private investment vehicle called Lakeshore Meridian Partners. Lakeshore Meridian Partners was a subsidiary of a holding company called Nash River Capital. Nash River Capital was wholly owned by the Nash Land Trust. Verity sat very still. "He built his career on my grandmother's money," she said. "He built his career on his own talent and effort," Jeffrey said carefully. "The work was his. But the platform that let him survive the first 2 years of Corktown, the capital that kept him operational through 2 rounds of investor hesitation, that was the Nash Trust. Arranged anonymously, through structures entirely invisible from the outside. Why did she do it? Jeffrey opened a sealed envelope and removed a handwritten note. He read from it. If the man my granddaughter chooses needs a foundation beneath him to become what he might be, I'll help build it. What he does with what I give him will tell us everything we need to know. He set the paper down. She wrote that the year before she died, she left it here for this moment. Verity pressed her lips together. She knew, she said quietly. She prepared for it. Yes, and there's something else. He opened the third folder. The Lakeshore Meridian agreements include standard provisions. Any major new capital structure involving the original assets requires notification and approval from the senior investment partner, which is Nash River Capital, which is you. He paused. Mr. Harker has recently entered preliminary discussions with a development group about a significant joint venture. A project in northern Ontario, land that borders the Rideau Valley Conservation Corridor. What land specifically? Jeffrey slid a map across the table. She looked at it. The land whose permits and easements Collins' project absolutely required, that land was Nash Trust land. He had no idea. She was not simply a woman he had discarded. She was, if she chose to exercise it, legally positioned to determine the future of the most significant project of his career. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she asked about the development partner. Jeffrey's pause was half a second too long. The firm is called Pryce Meridian Capital, he said, based in Calgary. 3 years old. He slid a printed sheet across the table. The principal is a woman named Ainsley Pryce. The name landed like something physical. She wasn't simply available to be found, Verity said slowly. She found him. That would be my assessment. Why? What's the connection to my family? Jeffrey folded his hands. Ainsley Pryce's father was a contractor named Bernard Pryce, who worked on one of your grandmother's early commercial projects in the late 1980s. Site preparation, work outside Barrie. He was paid the contracted amount. His business folded 2 years later, and he spent the rest of his life believing Adora Nash had cheated him out of what he was owed. Did she? That, Jeffrey said carefully, is what I've spent the past 12 hours establishing. He slid another document across the table. Bernard Pryce had a business partner at the time, a man named Wallace Greer. The payment from the Nash estate went to the partnership account. The partnership then dissolved under disputed circumstances, and I have good reason to believe that Wallace Greer redirected those funds. He paused. What I can tell you with confidence is that boy paid what she owed. Bernard Pryce likely never received his portion of it. The room was very quiet. Ainsley grew up believing my grandmother destroyed her father, Verity said. Yes. And she might not be wrong that something destroyed him, but she has the wrong person. That appears to be the case. Verity looked at the photograph of her grandmother she had set on the folder before the meeting. Habit, a kind of anchor, that face, that absolute clarity. I need to meet Ainsley Pryce, she said, not through lawyers myself. She called Cora that afternoon. Cora Finlayson was Verity's oldest friend in Toronto, sharp-eyed, fiercely loyal, and so thoroughly connected in the city's professional world that she had once described her social network as a conflict of interest waiting to happen. She had texted 11 times over the past 2 days. She answered on the first ring. Verity Nash, she said, and the relief in her voice was enormous. I have been absolutely losing my mind. I know, I'm okay, Cora. I need your help. What do you need? Ainsley Pryce, do you know her? A short pause. I know of her. Calgary money, they say. Sits on the planning committee for the waterfront revitalization gala. Why? Can you get me in the same room as her? Something that looks accidental. An event, a dinner. You want to run into the woman your husband left you for. I want to talk to her, Verity said, without it looking like I sought her out. Cora was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a benefit dinner Thursday night. Royal, Ontario Museum, the Conservation Wing anniversary. Her firm is a sponsor. I'm on the host committee. Another beat. I can seat you adjacent. Perfect. Verity, Cora's voice dropped into something fierce and quiet. He is a complete and thorough fool. Despite everything, something almost like a smile crossed Verity's face. I know. Thursday, I'll send you the details. She spent 2 days preparing, not just the legal files. She read everything she could find about the Pryce family, the Barry Project, Wallace Grier, and what had become of him. She found probate records, a civil dispute from 1994, a deposition in which Grier described the partnership dissolution in terms that read alongside the Nash estate's payment records about where Bernard Pryce's money had actually gone. It was not a story that exonerated everyone, but it was a story in which Adora Nash was not the villain. Thursday arrived cold and clear. Verity wore a dark navy suit she had bought 3 years ago and never worn, structured, quiet, the kind of thing that doesn't ask for attention and doesn't need it, her grandmother's watch on her left wrist, no other jewelry. She found her table. Across the room she found Ainsley. Ainsley in this setting was precisely what you would expect of someone who had built a career through intelligence and relentless positioning, composed, attentive, laughing at exactly the right moments, her attention fully deployed wherever it would do the most good. She was very good at this. Verity could see that clearly and found she could separate the observation from any feeling about it. During the keynote address, Ainsley looked up. She saw Verity across the room. Something crossed her face, composed, recovered in under 2 seconds, but not before Verity had registered it. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like the expression of someone who has walked into a room and understood too late that the geography is not what they planned for. Verity held her gaze. She didn't perform coldness or wounds or the theater of a wronged woman. She simply looked back, steady and clear, and she was not what Ainsley had anticipated. Ainsley looked away first. After dessert, Verity stood, set her napkin on the table, and walked across the room. She stopped beside Ainsley's chair. Ainsley looked up. The composure was immaculate, but the posture underneath it was braced. "Hello, Ainsley," Verity said, quietly, evenly. Verity. For just a fraction of a syllable, Ainsley's voice almost broke on the name, then steadied. "I didn't expect you here." "I know," Verity said. "When you have a moment, just 5 minutes, there's something you should know." Ainsley's jaw tightened. She was calculating. 5 minutes, she said finally. "That's all I need." They found a quiet room off the east corridor. Ainsley closed the door. She turned around, and for the first time, Verity saw what was underneath the polish. A deep, particular ocean, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for so long you've stopped noticing the weight until someone names it. "What do you want?" Ainsley said. "The same thing you do," Verity said. "The truth." Ainsley stared at her. "I know about your father," Verity said. "I know about the Barry Project. I know what you believe my grandmother did to him." Something moved through Ainsley's face. Confirmation. And then something underneath that was harder to name. A kind of grief that had been waiting its whole life for the right context. "Then you know why," Ainsley said. "I know why you started," Verity said. "I'm not certain you know the full story." She told her, carefully, completely, not the legal version, but the human one, what the payment records showed, what Jeffrey had found about Wallace Grier, what the deposition said about the partnership account and where the funds had gone, and what it meant about who had actually taken what from Bernard Pryce. She watched Ainsley's face as she spoke. It was like watching someone have the ground shift beneath them, not collapse, but shift, the way foundations do when something load-bearing, for a long time turns out to have been built, on an assumption that was always slightly off. When she finished, the room was quiet. "He could still be right," Ainsley said. Her voice was flat, controlled. "It doesn't mean. It means the person who wronged your father may not have been Adora Nash," Verity said. "I'm not saying your family's grief wasn't real. I'm saying the target may have been wrong, and everything you've built on that target." "Don't," Ainsley said. Verity waited. I've spent 10 years on this, Ainsley said after a moment. The control in her voice had changed. Not broken, but different, like glass under pressure that has just been told it can stop. I built my entire firm around having leverage against the Nash name. I found Colin because he was the closest access point I had. She stopped, and then it got complicated, Verity said. Ainsley looked at the window. That's one way to say it. A pause. He doesn't know any of this, Ainsley said. He thinks he found an investor. He has no idea about the Nash connection, about any of it. I know, Verity said. I'm going to tell him. He'll be devastated. Yes, Verity agreed, he will be. Another silence. What do you want from me? Ainsley said finally, not defensive, genuinely asking. I don't want anything from you, Verity said, but I'm going to offer you something. I had my solicitor look into what your father was actually owed under the Berry contract, with 35 years of consideration, added. It's not an admission of fault by the Nash estate, because I don't believe Adora was at fault. But it's an acknowledgement that something went wrong, and that your family paid for it, and that matters, regardless of who ultimately caused it. Ainsley stared at her. Why would you do that? Because it's the right thing to do, Verity said. And because my grandmother, if she had known what happened to your family, would have wanted it done. She was a great believer in correcting what could be corrected. Ainsley was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I need to think. Take whatever time you need, Verity said. She looked at Ainsley one more time. This woman who had come into her life like a planned detonation and turned out to be something far more human and far more broken than any plan could contain. Then she nodded once, honestly, one person to another, and walked back into the gala. She called Colin the next morning. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice careful and business neutral. Verity. Colin, she said, I need to meet with you, not about the settlement, about your company. A pause. My company is fine. I know you believe that, she said. There's something you need to understand about its history. Before you go any further with the Northern Ontario project, please meet with me. She heard him thinking. She heard the faint sound of the city through whatever window he was standing beside. Tomorrow, he said finally. My office noon. I'll be there. She arrived at 11:55. The receptionist showed her to the corner conference room, the impressive one. Full view of the city. She understood the choice. Colin was managing his anxiety by surrounding himself with evidence of what he had built. He arrived at noon exactly. He had slept badly and spent effort ensuring it didn't show. He looked like a man who was slightly more afraid than he had planned to be. She started at the beginning. She told him about Adora Nash. About 60 years of private wealth accumulated with the specific intention of invisibility. About the promise Verity had kept for 14 years, including the 14 years she had spent married to him. She watched him absorb it. She watched him try to fit the information onto the wife he had believed he knew thoroughly. Then she told him about Lakeshore Meridian Partners, about Nash River Capital, about the Corktown project, and the 2 funding rounds that had kept him operational in years 2 and 3, when everything else was uncertain. The moment it landed, she saw it happen. Something internal, a structural collapse that was completely contained and completely visible to anyone who had spent 14 years learning the geography of that face. His hands, which had been resting flat on the table, drew slightly inward. You funded my company, he said, almost inaudible. My grandmother did, she said, anonymously, because she wanted to give you the tools to become what you might be, and see what you would do with them. He was quiet for a long time. I've been telling people for 11 years that I built this from nothing, he said. You built it, she said. The talent was yours. The decisions, the good ones and the difficult ones, were yours. But the foundation, Colin, the floor you stood on in those first 2 years, that was mine. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. And the Northern Ontario project, Verity continued. She slid a map across the table. The conservation easements your permits have to run through, the land your access rights depend on, she pointed. That's Nash Trust land. You need my signature to proceed. He stared at the map. You were holding the whole thing up, he said slowly. The whole time. He looked up, and I looked at you and said you weren't enough. You did, she said quietly. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. Something was leaving him. Not the intelligence, not the capacity, but the armor. The particular armor of a man who has told himself for long enough that he built everything alone that he has begun to mistake the story for the fact. What are you going to do? He said. I'm not going to block your project, she said. That's not what this is. I'm going to give you the full picture, so you can make decisions about your company's future with accurate information. I'd like to restructure the Nash River capital agreements, so you have clean, clear title going forward. The approval provisions dissolve. What you build from here is genuinely yours. He looked at her for a long time. Why? He said. Because I spent 14 years believing in what you were capable of, she said. I'd like that to mean something. Not to us. That's done, and I know it. But to the work. I'd like the work to be clean. He was very still. The settlement I offered you, he said after a moment. His voice had lost every rehearsed quality. It was just Colin now, unguarded and raw. 2 years I should. He stopped. It was insulting. I know that. Your lawyer will be in touch with Jeffrey Marr, she said. We'll work something appropriate out. That's not why I came. She stood. She picked up her bag. Colin, she said. He looked up. Build the Northern Ontario project the right way. It's good land. It deserves a good project. And you have the capacity to build one. You always have. Stop building for the story you want people to tell about you and build for the land itself. You used to know the difference. He looked at her for a long, unguarded moment, and in his face she saw something she had not seen in years. The person he had been before success convinced him that the person he was performing was the same as the person he actually was. I'm sorry, he said, not the apology of a man managing his image, the other kind, for how I did it, for bringing her there, for the ring, for what I said. I'm genuinely sorry. I believe you, she said. Build something worth it. She walked out. She stood on King Street in the November cold, hands in her pockets, and she looked at the city around her for a long moment. All those buildings, all that glass holding the light. Her phone buzzed. Jeffrey, how did it go? She typed back, he's going to do the right thing. Give him time. She put the phone away and started walking. Not toward the hotel. She was done with the hotel. Toward the townhouse in the annex that she had not yet told anyone she owned, because that was a story for another day, and there were several more stories ahead of her yet. 6 weeks later, the Nash Land Trust announced, for the first time in its 60-year history, that it would be operating under a public name. The Nash Foundation for Land and Community was formally incorporated in December. Its mandate was the conservation of rural Ontario land held in perpetual trust, alongside a community investment stream for small and rural development projects that traditional capital had overlooked for decades. Verity Nash's name was on the letterhead. It was the first time the Nash name had appeared publicly in connection with the family's resources. The decision to step out of the invisibility her grandmother had so carefully constructed was not easy. Adora had believed in privacy as a form of protection. Verity understood that. She also understood something her grandmother had never quite been forced to reckon with, that you cannot change anything from behind a curtain. That the power she now carried openly was more useful than the power she had carried in secret if she was willing to attach her for it. The announcement appeared in 3 national papers and 1 financial outlet that ran a piece with the headline, Who is Verity Nash? The quiet billionaire Ontario didn't know it had. Cora called within 4 minutes. Billionaire, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Verity, it says billionaire. Approximately, Verity said. This whole time, Cora said. This whole time I have been your closest friend, and you have been. Keeping a promise, Verity said. A pause. Are you ready for all of this? Verity looked out the window of the annex townhouse. November had become December, and Toronto was doing what it always does in December, drawing inward, quieting, settling into itself. Yes, she said, I think I finally am. Ainsley called the following week. She had read the announcement. She had spent 5 weeks sitting with everything. Verity had told her, and she had done her own research, and she had found the records of what had happened to Wallace Greer, and the partnership account, and the money that had left it. She had also spoken with her mother, which had been the hardest conversation either of them had ever had. I want to take you up on the offer, Ainsley said. Her voice was different from every version of it Verity had heard before. Stripped of strategy. Just a person talking to another person. Not the financial part. I mean, eventually, yes. But first I want to understand the full picture. What actually happened. We can do that, Verity said. I've been building toward the wrong thing for a very long time, Ainsley said. I don't quite know what I'm supposed to do now. Most people don't, Verity said. When they set something heavy down, it takes a while to figure out what your hands are for. A pause, then something that was almost a laugh, exhausted, real. The kind that comes out when something is too absurd and too human to answer any other way. My grandmother used to say that, Verity said. They talked for an hour. Not about the Nash Trust or the legal arrangements, or what Colin was doing with the Northern Ontario permits, which he had restructured cleanly with both legal teams in agreement. They talked about Ainsley's father, what he had been like before the business collapsed, the stories she had grown up hearing and the ones she was beginning to reconsider. They talked about what it means to grieve someone's life, as well as their death. About the difference between anger inherited and anger earned, and what you do with yourself when you can no longer tell them apart. It was not a simple conversation. It was not the beginning of a friendship, exactly. It was something more tentative and more honest than that, two people sorting out what they owed each other and what they owed themselves, and which version of the story was actually true. Colin's company restructured over the following months. He brought his two most trusted partners fully into the picture about the Nash River capital history, and they handled it with the steadiness of people who have built things with their hands and understand that foundations sometimes need to be re-examined in the light. The Northern Ontario project went forward, with the Nash Foundation holding a conservation easement on the adjacent land and a partnership agreement ensuring the development remained aligned with the corridor it bordered. It was, by most accounts, a better project for the complexity, better than the version he would have built in ignorance. He called Verity once, in January, not about the legal arrangements, just to say he had driven out to Perth County, past the 7 toward the old farm roads, on a clear day, that he had thought about what she said, about building for the land rather than for the story. She listened. She said good. And she meant it, not without complication, but genuinely. She opened the Foundation's first application cycle in February. 114 applications arrived in the first 2 weeks. She read every one of them herself, in the early mornings in the annex townhouse, tea going cold beside her. The city waking up, outside the window 1 gray degree at a time. Some of them made her hands go still over the keys. Not from sentiment, she was not sentimental about hardship. But some of them were so precisely the thing she had been trying to describe. People carrying more capacity than the world had given them room to use, that she felt them the way you feel the exact right word for something you have been trying to say for a long time. She approved 14 applications in the first cycle. She called each founder personally. On the day she made the last call, she sat at her grandmother's old desk, moved from farmhouse storage the previous month and placed in the study where it belonged, and she looked at the photograph on the shelf. Adora Nash at 80 standing in the October garden looking directly at the camera with that expression she always had. Clear, patient, quietly amused by how long some things take to arrive. I think I understand what you were waiting for, Verity said. She opened her laptop. She opened a new document. At the top she typed 5 words. what I want to build. Then she started writing. She had 14 years of quiet and a grandmother's 60-year fortune, and the particular hard-earned clarity of a woman who has looked at the full truth of her own story and decided to stay in the room with it. She had at last everything she needed to begin.